So I'm the token biodiversity person here today, and I am a tropical ecologist. I study birds specifically. I'm not going to talk a lot about birds today, but I've been worrying about the conservation of tropical birds for about 35 years. I feel like I'm in a 12-step program, you know. So, and some of the stuff I've heard today scares the heck out of me, especially the last few talks, because they have fundamental effects on the viability of bird populations and the viability of bird communities in the tropics. So I'm just going to talk about some general stuff today, so just some general propositions, some general talking points, and hopefully that'll spur some conversation. Okay, so this is the tropics. No one's actually showed a map of the tropics yet. And one thing I want to point out, and this is being an ecologist, ecologists just love to talk about diversity. We based ourselves in diversity. We want to put labels on everything. Everything's got to be different, okay? But the tropics are not this anonymous thing. They are very, very diverse within the tropics. There's the paleotropics, or the old world tropics, which have a very different biogeographic and land use history than the neotropics or new world tropics. The earth science of the tropics in different regions is very, very different. And the amount of deforestation or the amount of disturbance, anthropogenic disturbance that these regions have experienced in the last 20,000 to 50,000 years is very, very different. Elevational gradients. Some areas of the tropics have no dry season. Some have 2 dry seasons. Some have 1 dry season. So the tropics are very, very different. So we need to be careful about statements saying, well, tropical things do this or tropical things do that, because there's really a lot of ecological and physical differences at tropical latitudes. Okay, if I can do it. So, this is a heat map showing the distribution of global biodiversity. And this is why people like me go to the tropics. Phenomenal biodiversity at tropical latitudes. There's about 10,000 species of birds, 6,000 of them are endemic to tropical latitudes. There is no place where you can go where the diversity, at least and I have a terrestrial bias, where the diversity of biodiversity is so high as it is in the tropics, okay? One thing about the tropics is not only are there a lot of species, a lot of them are endemic, okay? They don't occur anywhere else. And a lot of them are what are called restricted range species. They have very small ranges. So because of this, they're very sensitive to disturbance. They're very sensitive to land loss, okay? And if we're going to conserve biodiversity, whether it's birds or mammals or insects or trees or what have you, because this is a sum total biodiversity for all those groups, then we really need to be thoughtful. And I don't want to say there's one size fits all for the conservation of tropical biodiversity, okay? Things you worry about with birds are very different than what you worry about with lizards or what you worry about with snakes, okay? But this pattern is very, very clear and very, very consistent at these latitudes. This is where the conservation, the diversity of life resides, in large part, is at tropical latitudes. So, we also have a lot of people at tropical latitudes. Okay, and this may be a dated graph, but this just shows the general distribution of people. And these people need to eat. These people need to live. They need to have well-being, or we strive for that. A lot of the talks today have talked about that. And this is where we're growing a lot of crops. You may notice that a lot of it, and this is an older map, but you may notice that a lot of this is at tropical latitudes as well. So we have this inherent conflict between where biodiversity resides and demands on the land. And those demands on the land are from people, and people really matter. I'm not a conservation biologist that thinks people don't matter. People matter first, okay? So we really need to be thoughtful about how we proceed in order to try and conserve biodiversity. And there's a lot of challenges out there. So we're losing a lot of forests. Some of these are old data. I use Manga Bay a lot because they have these great graphs. I don't even know how accurate they are, but they're just great to lift off of the web. So you can see these rates of deforestation here. You know, Brazil, I don't mean to pick on Brazil, okay, and I'm showing a graph next that shows that rates of deforestation have decreased a lot, and several people have mentioned that. But we're seeing a lot of deforestation, and a lot of that deforestation or a lot of that habitat loss is understandably due to agriculture. And I should add that none of it is as high as the landscape you see when you fly out of Champaign today. Okay? Illinois has lost 98% of its natural habitat. Okay? There's nothing like that as bad in the tropics yet. Hopefully there never will be. Okay? And I should add that the wildlife and bird populations and whatnot in Illinois have been actually pretty resilient. There's lots of reasons to think the tropical biota may not be as resilient as temperate zone biota. Okay, just a similar graph, a little more up to date. And this shows just where the rate of deforestation in Brazil, at least, has decreased. Okay, so that's kind of nice news. I like to hear that. So we're losing a lot of habitat. We're losing most of it to agriculture, not all of it. Okay, agriculture is not a bad guy in this thing. It's an understandable player in how we use the land. But what's happening is we are losing a lot of land. And conservation biologists talk about two things when we're talking about loss of habitat. One is just straight out loss, and the other one is fragmentation. So those of you that are familiar with this story know that fragmentation, you've been reading about fragmentation. If you're a conservation biologist, half the course in a cons bio course will be on fragmentation and what happens with fragmentation. But not only do we get outright loss of habitat, but we get the habitat that's left. What results is the habitat that's left is in small parcels, okay? These small parcels don't function the same way as large tracts of forest. If you had a 1,000-acre or hectare tract of forest intact, that would biologically be very, very different than 1,001 hectare tracts of forest, okay? They are fundamentally different for agriculture or anything else, but they're really different for biodiversity, okay? They just don't function the same. And in this case, bigger is always better, okay? When in doubt, bigger is better. Just that's a mantra you should always, take home when you're thinking about designing landscapes and whatnot, is large tracts of uninterrupted forest tend to do better biologically, tend to have greater ecological integrity than small tracts of forest. So often you end up with a landscape that may look like this, okay? Where you have a series of forest tracts, okay? But they tend to be isolated. They may not be connected, okay? They tend to be of different sizes, and what goes on in terms of the microclimate and other things in these forest tracts is very different than if we had a large tract of intact forest, okay? There's intrinsic things about the physical environment that are different, and also the biology of a lot of constituent or resident species is very different inside these small tracts. A lot of species just can't persist in these small tracts of forest as opposed to one large tract of forest. Ecologists are often accused of not having a lot of general rules, okay? One of the rules you can depend on in ecology is what's called the species area effect. That with larger tracts or a larger area, you're going to have more species, whether it's fish, whether it's plants, bugs, amoebas, whatever, okay? A larger area will simply house or be hospitable to more species. Now, why that is, we've been arguing about that for the last 50 years or so, but it's still a rule that's there, and it's very useful or very instructive or very prescriptive for conservation policy. So what goes on in these? Well, we do have a decrease in species richness and altered community composition. So where I work in Panama, I work in a fairly intact forest, but we've also done a lot of work in small parcels of forest in the old canal zone. And there's just a lot of species, there's whole guilds of species that you don't see in these small tracts of forest. They just don't exist there. One of the best examples of this is the fragmentation experiment that was done in Manaus, okay, that Tom Lovejoy, who a lot of you have worked with or know very well, started years ago, and that clearly demonstrates over decades of very carefully drawn data that small tracts just don't house the same kind of community that large tracts do. In addition to that, what you see in small tracts of forest is you tend to see the same kinds of species in these different small tracts of forest. That's what's called biological homogenization, okay? And you just see these things that are tolerant of this, that are tolerant of edge effects, that can do well, that are willing to cross these openings, or these don't represent physiological barriers to these species. You just tend to see the same thing everywhere. So you get a general, you get fewer species, and you don't get a lot of diversity over space with these species. You also get a change in microclimate that's been brought up before. There's a tendency for fragments in the tropics to dry out. They're more exposed to wind. The perimeter to surface area ratios change. They just are very, very different for a lot of species. And the physical climate is very, very different. Smaller and smaller, it gets more and more different. And a lot of species just don't do well there, especially ectothermic species, those whose body temperature is regulated by the environment, so lizards and insects and whatnot, not to mention trees. Nutrient retention, I'm not even going to go there because there's too much expertise in the room, but pollination services and just overall productivity, all of the productivity of these areas is compromised in a fragmented situation. Okay, so the ecological services that we may gain from from ecological integrity are really compromised in a fragmented landscape. Okay, so we tend to get that where we have agricultural development. You tend to get, there was a bunch of graphs I was going to show where they've shown where the average size of a forest tract where there has been agricultural development gets smaller and smaller as the agricultural development gets more intense. Okay. Another thing that's important about tropical species is, and there's some theory for this, but some of you may be familiar with Dan Jansen. He's a famous tropical biologist. I feel like I should genuflect when I mention Dan Jansen. Okay. He wrote a paper in 1966 called Why are mountain passes higher in the tropics? And what he was saying is because the tropics are relatively aseasonal, that tropical species don't have the physiological mechanisms to handle climate change. They don't have the physiological mechanisms to take environmental change. And because of that, they have trouble with altered environments as opposed to species around here that see a lot of seasonality every year. I've got 2 minutes, so I need to go. A couple things that I'm going to throw in here just as kickers, okay? Another thing about tropical deforestation is there's a field called ecoepidemiology, and has to do with zoonoses and just the disease systems and whatnot. As it turns out, and upon reflection, this graph doesn't show it very well, but it's a heck of a paper, okay, that so my apologies to these authors, is that the incidence and prevalence of malaria and other vector-borne diseases increases, at least initially, with deforestation. So there's a real human health or a public health issue associated with this as well. And given that we've had something like 400 emerging infectious diseases in the last century or so, and about 60 of them are zoonotic events from wildlife and whatnot, I think we need to be concerned about this, is that the actual public health aspects of deforestation and fragmentation are there as well. Okay, one thing I'm going to go through really quick is precipitation. Great talk so far on how deforestation and how climate change are going to change precipitation. Precipitation is everything for the biology of tropical species. Their whole life history is geared around when rain falls and how much rain does fall. I work in Panama where there's a distinctive dry season, and I work on birds. Almost all the bird species start breeding when it starts raining, okay, at the end of the dry season. And I've done quite a bit of work on this, and this is for those of you who have worked on this, I'm going to go over this very quickly, but it shows that this is at least this one paper shows that there may be a tipping point where the amount of local deforestation actually has an effect on rainfall relative to 100% forested site. I think this is held up. There seems to be a lot of circumstance. I don't know if the details are right. I'm not an earth scientist, but what this says is if you get large clearings, you're going to get less and less rainfall. This is devastating news for a tropical biologist who's interested in conservation. This is devastating because it's going to change the most fundamental selective pressure that they have and the most fundamental environmental driver on their viability. Just to show this very quickly, this is something that I worked on. Someone talked about a graph earlier being 10 years of their life. This is my whole frickin' career right here, okay? All right? This is 35 years of data, okay? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but what this is these are estimated coefficients between population growth rates of 20 bird species and length of the dry season, okay? And what this means is if it's below this bar, and these are Bayesian credibility intervals, okay? Below this bar, below this dashed line is bad, okay? That means the longer the dry season, it has a significant negative effect on the viability of these bird populations. This is in an intact forest, okay? This is not a deforestation story. Most of the tropics, a lot of just, notwithstanding the deforestation study, are expected to get drier and drier. This really is going to change things, okay? All right, so I'll show a cloud forest where it's still wet, okay? What this means is that we really need to be thoughtful about how we design our landscapes, how we retain our natural habitat. I thought the previous talk was just perfect on that in terms of designing our landscape to the extent that we can, and a lot of it we don't have this chance. But if we do not retain large tracts of forest where these, perhaps these precipitation refugia, as the Australians call it, for tropical biota, then we are going to lose a fundamentally huge amount of biodiversity in the next 100 years or so. And on that happy note, I'll leave to questions. Thank you.